5:30 Eastern Time on the COVID Calls YouTube channel. You can also follow up and hear COVID Calls anytime out of a large archive on Spotify, iTunes, or Podbeam. And you can follow COVID Calls on Twitter at the handle US of Disaster or at COVID Calls. So spread the word about COVID Calls and send in any suggestions for guests and future topics. As of today, July 26th, there have been over 4 million confirmed global deaths from COVID-19, over 600,000 deaths in the US, and over 50,000 deaths just in the state of Texas. These figures deserve our continued attention and analysis. A goal of COVID Calls has been to document both the harms and suffering of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the inventive and sustained ways that people in various positions around the world have worked to understand and address the pandemic in many, many different ways, not only on the healthcare front. And as a key focus has been on the ways that people have continued to work within extraordinary constraints, often learning more about the problems that they're working on because of what the COVID pandemic has exposed. And we have an opportunity to go in depth on this today with our guest today, Kaiba White. James?
Sure. So Kaiba White is a real mover and a shaker in Austin's renewable energy and climate policy scene, where she contributes to policy research, online activism, grassroots organizing, and coalition building, as well as recruiting and overseeing interns. She has a strong background in social science and policy analysis, earning her bachelor's degree in sociology from Rice University in 2006, and her master's degree in urban and environmental policy and planning from Tufts University in 2009. Since 2012, she's been the energy policy expert and outreach specialist for the Texas Office of Public Citizen, a nonprofit consumer advocacy group. And she's also the president of Solar Austin, a local nonprofit seeking to accelerate a just and equitable transition to a strong renewable powered economy. Kaiba also serves on the City of Austin's Resource Management Commission and has taken leadership roles in the development of Austin Energy's Resource Generation and Climate Protection Plan, as well as the city's Climate Equity Plan. I know Kaiba to be not only a passionate environmentalist, which she definitely is, but also an informed and astute critical thinker with deep commitments to energy's complex equity issues and to the principles of environmental justice. With that, let's bring Kaiba into the call. So thank you for joining us today, Kaiba. We're very lucky to have you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that warm welcome, and I'm happy to be here. This is a good opportunity to talk about the things that we have going on in Austin as they relate to the pandemic, as well as our kind of energy and climate priorities.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad this is a mutually a great opportunity for this conversation, and I'm excited for what we'll discuss coming forward. To begin, can you just sort of like tell us a little bit about the general situation in Austin and how the pandemic has unfolded there?
Well, there's been a lot of ups and downs in Austin, as there have been throughout the state of Texas and really around the world. And unfortunately, right now, Austin is experiencing a significant surge in cases and in hospitalizations, and has now entered stage 4, and that's out of 5. So the city is now, encouraging everyone to wear a mask, even if you are vaccinated, because we know that while the vaccines are, they are good, they do stop most cases. They do not stop all cases. And we are seeing those breakthrough cases in Austin, right, as folks are everywhere. And unfortunately, not enough people have got vaccinated to stop this pandemic. And so, we're reaping the consequences of that right now, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. So on an unfortunate, sort of heading back downward into the deep pandemic at this moment.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
Sorry, yeah. So like heading like where there have been some improvements at different times, like sort of now heading back down into sort of shutting things down again, more restrictive measures, not square one, but a few steps back.
Yeah, I think if we had a different state government, we probably would be talking about more restrictive measures. As it is in Texas, cities are very limited on what they can legally require. So, in Austin, it does come in the form of guidance. I'm hopeful that a lot of businesses will take that guidance and therefore will have an effect on some individual behaviors. But yeah, I think it's a kind of a sad moment that we're re-entering these kind of higher levels of cases and illness that we could be preventing at this stage.
Sure. Yeah. So I, as a sort of a different spin, I'm also sort of curious. One of the questions we often ask has been, what do you have, like, what has impacted you during this, your experience of the pandemic? So like, what is maybe one of your strongest memories or associations with the pandemic as it's taken place in the past 18 months or so?
Well, when the pandemic started, I was, I guess, entering my third trimester of pregnancy.
Yeah.
So definitely, I think the strongest moment for me was, reading about what was going on in New York City and about, pregnant women having to give birth without, any partner or support person there with them. And that was pretty scary for me on a personal level. And I'm grateful that I did not have to go through that, that my husband was there for the birth of our son and that neither of us contracted COVID and, none of the three of us did. And we've remained safe. But, having now 13-month-old baby, 13 months today, obviously he is unvaccinated. And so that remains key on my mind when I'm thinking about the pandemic in general, and certainly about my behavior and, the behavior of the people that I come into contact with.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 What a time to, be going through these stages that are so exciting and that everyone's supposed to be, always looks forward to. So yeah. Wow. So outside of the more personal level, I also know, Kaiba, you're, like, as I said in the introduction, you wear many hats in the Austin scene, extensively involved in renewable energy and in climate policy, and in trying to organize around environmental justice. And I'm just sort of wondering, can you speak a little bit about how COVID has unfolded in all these worlds that you're a part of, and how that's impacted sort of like your day-to-day in these efforts?
Yeah. I mean, it's been such a dramatic change from, my day-to-day was pre-COVID was a lot of, moving around from one in-person meeting to the next, be it with a group of advocates or a neighborhood organization or individual community members or leaders, or elected officials or city staffers. All of those meetings were all happening in person, and they all shifted to remote. Everything and pretty much everything is in my work world right now has remained remote. There have been some things that have shifted to in person, but that was such a huge change, and it brought some challenges, but it did also bring some opportunities.
Sure.
I think I saw that in some cases, I think there were people who weren't participating as much when things were in person because they maybe didn't have the time to get there, or they didn't have the ability to get across town to a meeting or whatever. So having a remote option, I think, has the potential to expand participation for some people. And I think it did do that. When it comes to my work with Solar Austin, we were just, kind of working on a pilot program for students of color and women students to get paid internships in the clean energy industry. And, we thought that those were all going to be in person. And instead, we pivoted and they were remote internships. And, we were kind of worried about that, but it actually has worked out really well for the most part. And, now we're kind of into a hybrid model where some are remote and some are in person. And I think that there's a lot of value in having that flexibility.
Sure.
Could you say a little more about that? I know that many of listeners of COVID calls are also educators. And so the kind of the way that you built energy and process in the intern program when it was fully virtual, going to hybrid, what worked and what did you learn from the process of building the program?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is communication. When you're in person, there's a lot more organic communication. And, I've seen that throughout all aspects of my work that, when you show up to a meeting in person, you might get there a little early and you have some conversations. You might stay a little late. You have some more conversations. It's not just about the official business. And I think the same is true to a certain extent with our Solar Austin internship program. You don't have that as much organic interaction. So you have to really be intentional about connecting with people. And you can do that over the phone. You can do it via text. You can do it over, video meetings, whatever. But you do have to be a little more intentional about it. And in terms of, the internship program specifically, one of the things that we have done is really try to prepare the students for, what kind of proper etiquette and behavior is when doing a remote internship, so that they, do take it as seriously as they would if they were in person.
Sure.
And then also, talking with the employers about how to try to integrate those interns even in a remote environment. So how to, make sure that they're setting up meetings so that some of that networking that is so valuable in an internship experience can still happen.
Yeah.
What are your goals with the internship program? And I'll foreshadow a little. I'm interested in what you consider the kind of skills that you want them to build, but also the kind of scenarios you see them entering, especially amidst all the contentions and contestations of energy transition. How do you prepare them for the space they'll work in as much as the work itself?
Yeah, so I guess first, our goal with the program is to improve diversity and equity and inclusion within the clean energy industry, because we see that, while there is some level of diversity, there's still a disproportionate, male white workforce there. And these are good jobs. It's a growing industry. And one of, I think the important things that we need to keep in mind as we're working for climate justice is that we don't, we cannot recreate the, problematic systems just in a different industry. So we need to give everybody the opportunity to benefit from clean energy. And, a big part of that is the jobs themselves. So we are trying to set students up to actually have that foot in the door that is so key to kind of furthering your career. A lot of times these students are getting a great educational background, and so they have a lot of skills to offer, but they might not know anybody who works in clean energy. They, would just be kind of applying blind, and in a way they still are, but they're going through our program, which is specifically tailored to recruit those demographics, although anybody is welcome to apply. And of course, we consider all applicants, but we do also provide additional support. So we provide multiple layers of mentoring throughout the program to try to ensure success, which, does take some work sometimes with an intern. There's all kinds of ways that an internship can kind of go awry. And so we're there to try to step in and make it successful for the intern and for the company, because we believe that the companies also are going to benefit from, having a more diverse workforce.
Yeah, I remember you hosted a happy hour for Solar Austin where you discussed the internship program, right? And I remembered in that that the topic was also brought up, that how much of a learning experience it was for these companies, right? How like taking what it means to take on an intern, especially, and then like what it means how to like bring in entry level sort of like workforce and sort of like fulfill their commitments to this commitment to equity that they signed up for, right? How like the learning happens on both sides and both ends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, in most cases, the supervisors, those that are involved on the company side, are seeing that as a value. Yes, it takes some work, but at the end of the day, they're getting something for that learning experience.
Yeah.
And we see that many of them are, actually then going on to hire these interns into full-time positions, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I think it's especially important that you figured out how to sustain this during the pandemic, because it's so clear the way that the workforce implications of the pandemic have been so hard on women in particular. And so it's like, you found a countervailing way to address the pandemic through the internship program, even if indirectly.
Yeah. It's been very interesting in that, when we initially applied for the grant that funded the pilot program last summer, obviously there were still plenty of conversations about, racial equity going on, which is why the grant existed. But it was before this last, kind of round of interest that, was brought on by George Floyd's death and so many other similar events since then, unfortunately. But it ended up just, working out that our program was kind of perfectly poised to, really be a response to that, as well as the pandemic in a certain, little niche that we're focused on.
Kim, you mentioned the impact that COVID has had on the workforce, and so that like brings to mind for me the topic of energy vulnerability or energy poverty, and the way that COVID-19 has sort of exacerbated the energy burdens for people with more limited incomes. And Kaiba, I also know that you were part of a coalition of groups that co-authored a letter to Governor Abbott, right, talking about a moratorium on disconnections. So I'm wondering, can you share a little bit about what you learned through the pandemic about energy poverty or energy vulnerability, and maybe like some of the the best practices for how to address these problems moving forward?
Yeah, well, definitely, I think, like you said, the pandemic did exacerbate existing problems. So it's kind of, similar to many climate impacts in that way.
Sure.
Whatever problems you have underlying, when you have a crisis, you're just going to see them kind of on steroids. And, when you have, let's look at Austin, you have, a lot of high income residents, a lot of folks who have pretty well-paying jobs that maybe they were able, a lot of times those jobs were able to switch to remote work and be relatively unaffected. But at the same time, you have a lot of lower income workers who are in some way connected to the service industry. And of course, that was what has been hardest hit is, all of the bars and the restaurants and the music venues and, the music industry in general, in Austin. And, it's not just, the owners of those establishments. It is, everybody from, the wait staff to the, janitorial crews to, all of the kind of lower income, non-salaried kind of employees. And we see that then those are the folks who don't have a safety net more often than not. And when it comes to energy, they maybe have, some of them maybe have struggled in the past with bills. Some of them maybe haven't actually had a problem with their bills in the past, but they didn't
Right.
have enough of a cushion to get them through. And, thankfully the Austin Energy, which is, our municipally owned utility, did a good job. Austin Energy and the Austin City Council, which controls it, acted pretty quickly to, stop any disconnections and provide additional support actually to help folks pay their bills and make sure that people were not faced with, a pandemic without electricity and running water. But we saw something very different happening in other parts of the state. And some utilities eventually came around, and the Public Utility Commission took some action, but it fell well short of what was needed. And now here we are. The pandemic is still here. It's not a thing of the past, and yet, most of those programs have been eliminated, and people are going to be hurting in the months to come.
Right. Just for the sake of our listeners, I know, so you mentioned that Austin Energy is municipally owned. Can you just talk a little bit about like the different ways that utilities are structured in Texas? I know like Austin, is somewhat it's not alone, but it's somewhat unique as compared to some different areas that have like less democratic control over their utilities. And maybe you can help us, explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so I guess we kind of have four different structures in Texas, just to keep it nice and confusing for folks. And there are, a large number of municipally owned utilities. Most of them are in, smaller towns throughout Texas, but the San Antonio utility, CPS Energy, is the largest, followed by Austin Energy. Then there are a few others like Denton Electric and Garland Power and Light that are kind of in the middle range. And then there are a whole bunch of the small ones. Right. Those ones are controlled by their city councils. And then I guess the kind of next most democratically controlled are the electric co-ops. So in the Austin area, we have the Pedernales Electric Co-op to the west and the Bluebonnet Electric Co-op to the east. But I think there's 50 or 70, I forget, a large number. There are dozens of those throughout the state as well. And, they are governed by boards of directors that are elected by their members. I can go into how democratic or not that is at another time, but then the other two options are, within the ERCOT area, the retail electric providers, which are just, for-profit companies that are serving all of the, most of the customers in the DFW area, all of the customers in the Houston area, and a whole bunch of other parts of the state. And then we have some parts of the state that are outside of ERCOT, and they are generally served by vertically integrated utilities, but that are for profit. So, El Paso Electric, for example, is, a for-profit company that still has a monopoly.
Right. Yeah. So quite a patchwork of different models, different ways of structuring utilities, which I think in your letter emphasizes the role of the role that the state needs to take in order to sort of like have a more blanket coverage of protection, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges that we faced right from the beginning was just finding out what all these different utilities were doing or not doing when it comes to having a moratorium on disconnections or providing payment policy, payment plans, or any other types of assistance. There wasn't just a single database where you could go to find that. We were making calls and emails to each utility and trying to look at their websites. But what we found was that most of them didn't actually post anything publicly. So especially the electric co-ops, when we called, they might say, "Oh, we offer a payment plan. We're not disconnecting people," but they didn't publish that anywhere. So, well, there's a lot to I think be improved on there.
Is there any kind of database now, or are they supposed to be publishing these policies per law, or is some of the work in setting laws in place that would require this kind of data collection?
Yeah, there is no requirement, unfortunately, and there's still no database. What we were able to do was kind of get a snapshot that was as complete as we could get it at the time. But I couldn't speak now to which utilities are offering payment plans or disconnecting customers, because I would have to call them all back up again.
Do you think there's anyone in state government who considers that their responsibility to know these differences? And then bundled into that is, do you see a pattern across these in terms of their willingness and capacity to deal with vulnerable communities in their constituencies?
You mean within the electric co-ops, or?
Well, across the 4 types of providers.
Well, what we saw from the Public Utility Commission was that their view was that they only had jurisdiction to deal with basically the private companies, the retail electric providers, and they also did include those vertically integrated companies outside of ERCOT in some of their orders, but not all of them. So there was, even within what the PUC did take action on, it was a bit of a patchwork, but their view was that they didn't have any jurisdiction to tell the electric co-ops or the municipally owned utilities what they should do when it comes to disconnections or payment plans. So I think probably, it would take legislation to change that. I think there's some disagreement on whether or not that's an accurate kind of reading of the statute, whether the PUC maybe could have taken action. So, maybe if we had different state level leadership that had appointed different PUC commissioners, maybe we'd have a different outcome there. But I think right now with this leadership, this is what we can expect going forward.
In Texas, is there a crosstalk with people in other states, either because they're dealing with similar configurations of electricity provision plus state apparatus, or different? But how are you learning kind of beyond Texas borders, and how relevant is it to your work locally?
Yeah, when we were a little bit, we've kind of shifted focus to other things in more recent months. But when I was more focused on that, I was trying to learn what was going on in other states. And certainly there are other states that were in similarly bad situations as Texas was. And it really, unfortunately just comes down to advocacy to try to change that. There's not an easy fix. It requires, enough people and maybe enough of the right people speaking up and demanding a policy change.
So there's a bit of discussion about like data and transparency, and I know that maybe this can like facilitate a switch to talking more about the power crisis as well. So I know you've been quoted in a couple different places, Kaiba, in your commentary on the Texas power crisis about as like this is calling for like a greater need for transparency. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about what you were trying to unpack there, and maybe like the role that data might have in sort of like making sure that we have a way of preventing another sort of crisis happening?
Well, I don't think the kind of data access alone is
Sure.
The answer to preventing a crisis, but
Yeah.
Certainly there were certain pieces of data that people became very interested in during and after the Winter Storm Uri. I think probably the piece of data that folks were most interested in, but we might not ever get, is about these, what feeder am I on? What circuit am I on? Why was my circuit off? Well, my neighbors down the street had power. I don't necessarily think that it's wrong for that data to not be put out there, because there are probably some security and other challenges with that.
Okay.
But there was also, I think a lot of it kind of exposed how opaque, I guess, especially the natural gas industry is in the natural gas markets. Of course, you had a lot of power plants that they thought they had firm contracts. Now, some of them did not. Some of those power plants were rolling the dice and trying to save money by not having a firm contract, and then they didn't have access to gas to run their power plant. But there were others who did have firm contracts, and those contracts were just basically thrown out the window. And the natural gas companies would say that well, they couldn't make good on those contracts.
Sure.
But meanwhile, that there was gas at some points in the crisis that was being sold out of state. So and at quite a hefty cost. So, or a hefty profit for the companies. But I think it would take, it's not impossible, I'm sure, to track that down, but it would be a real challenge to figure out kind of, well, were there contracts that should have been, made good on that weren't? But we're just kind of at the mercy of the industry because it's so unregulated. Just as one example, but I think
Sure.
there was also, a lack of transparency about weatherization of power plants. There were, guidance being put out and, some internal tracking happening, but, nothing that was being published in any way that people could know what the level of risk was.
What about the arguments that the power crisis was in part due to the unreliability of renewable energy sources, which certainly got covered in press we were seeing in California? And I know that's, on one hand, easy for someone like you to kind of correct the record, but just tell us why was it possible to make that argument at this point? What does it teach us about the kinds of public understanding and communication we need to build going forward?
Well, I think it was possible to make that argument because, fossil fuel advocates have been pushing this message of renewable energy being unreliable for years. So they had, a certain audience that was primed to believe that because they had already heard it so many times. So they didn't even bother. Some folks did not bother to, check the facts before just assuming that, yeah, of course, this was the fault of wind and solar because we know it's unreliable. That is not actually the fact of the situation. The facts were that at that time in the winter, what is expected to be producing is predominantly natural gas. And that it was a failure of the natural gas industry all the way from the wellhead to power production. That said, I do think that there's a lot to be improved on within, renewable energy production. And I think that actually the renewable energy industries, wind, solar, batteries, are now, as a result, looking to be even more reliable and have more of a responsibility for, keeping the grid functioning, not just in the summer, which I think they're pretty well poised to do, but hopefully also in the winter as well. That wasn't the role that they were really prepared for. And we're not, ERCOT was not expecting there to be a lot of solar or a lot of wind. And so there was at least as much as they were planning on. So in that respect, they delivered as expected, whereas the natural gas, power plants came well under, and that's why we didn't have the needed power.
Does having the renewable energy industry and advocates in the mix, has it changed the conversation about the kind of social contract of the grid? Like, who's responsible for basic services and basic infrastructure? And are they, I guess, and I know they're very diverse within the industry, but, what kind of actor are they as as a kind of sector block?
That's a difficult question for me to even know the answer to, because I don't think they're one type of actor necessarily, but I do think that by and large, wind and solar companies want to be seen and want to actually be part of the solution, to climate change, to air pollution, to reliability, to all those things. And so it's in their self-interest to do everything that they can to make sure that their facilities are able to produce, as much as possible whenever energy is needed. But I did, kind of on a related note, really see a just very interesting dynamic as the storm was ongoing and right after, that it seemed like a lot of leaders, a lot of elected officials, especially in the Texas state government, seemed to kind of assume that there was actually a lot more centralized control of the system, that there was a lot more kind of socialized responsibility than there actually was. And, I found that very interesting, from a, kind of conservative, anti-socialist body that, they weren't advocating for a change towards greater socialism initially. They seemed to think that it already existed, that there already was a system in place to ensure that, that everybody was doing what they were supposed to do in terms of weatherizing their power plants and producing energy. But that's not the system that we have set up here in Texas. We have went pretty far in the direction of free market, and
Right.
you're gonna have some slip ups if that's the ethos that you're working under.
That reminds me of working at the grassroots around fence line communities and hazardous waste sites, and the profound disappointment so many people had that the EPA wasn't taking care of things. Like it didn't. And, that kind of moment of failed trust was really constitutive of the kind of what drove a certain generation of activists. And it's still really, it's hard to work. It's correct and really hard to work with as a kind of context for change. And it's interesting to think of the power crisis kind of bringing that to the fore. How did the COVID pandemic and the power crisis mirror or exacerbate each other, or just run side by side? I mean, and I know that's a huge high level question, but how have you thought about that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the fact that we, were in the COVID pandemic at a time when people needed each other in a very kind of physical way was made it very difficult. We had neighbors that were without power, literally a 5-minute walk down the street. And, there was only so much, that folks could do for each other. There was charging things up and providing water. And, there was one person actually a couple that we did invite to stay with us. They ended up declining because they didn't want to put us at risk. But, that's a difficult situation to be in, where you have to choose between, are you putting yourself at risk of a possibly deadly disease, or putting somebody else at risk? Or, do you huddle up freezing cold in your home? And that was just the very real situation that people were faced with. And a lot of folks did have to get together in ways that weren't, considered COVID safe, because they just couldn't, they could not live in their homes. And, we need to think about that going forward. But even looking at it now, it's one of those problems that I'm not sure that there's a full solution for.
Yeah. What was the information circulation during the freeze? Like, how did you know what was going on? And in any way, I mean, were you getting like pushed out messages from the city or not? And how did it run in parallel, or was it the same system utilized to encourage people to social distance and test and vaccinate? And like, were the two disasters treated as kindred by the system?
Gosh, I'm trying to remember. I think that we received maybe some text messages from the city, but there wasn't a lot of communication. I remember, receiving, I can't remember if it was an email or a text message that was, partway through the week, and the Austin water system was under a lot of stress. And I remember this message because it said to, please stop dripping your faucets. And of course, it was still, getting, well below freezing. And, it stuck in my mind because that seemed like really bad advice. But I don't remember a lot of messages coming in. And of course, that has been one of the big criticisms is, in general, not just in Austin, but across the state, a relative lack of communication to customers so they could know what to expect. Now, I think part of the challenge was that utilities didn't know what to expect. Now, they could have provided more information than they did, but there was just a lot of uncertainty, even I think at the highest levels.
Yeah. So I was really, moved by this recent study that I got a hold of by Caravallo et al., where they determined that across the state of Texas, communities of color were 4 times as likely to experience an outage as opposed to predominantly white communities. And I know you said that, there's not clear or like very precise or granular data about like which sort of circuits were shut off and like how those are connected and like how those decisions were made. But I know you've given some like discussion of like generally what the book says, like how those decisions might be made in these contexts. But then thinking about how that manifested in real time and like the way that these burdens were sort of unequally shared across, clearly across racial communities, racial barriers, racial divides. And so I'm just curious, like, if you can give us a little bit of information about like what that might mean for establishing something like energy justice moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, first knowing that fact, it's, questions come to mind of, wanting to know other pieces of data that might be connected to that. So,
Sure.
For example, what is the distribution of, the so-called kind of critical infrastructure that was supposed to kind of be protected from, cut off during these types of events? Because what we are told by the utilities is that, if you're on the same circuit or feeder as something that's a critical load, like a hospital or a fire station or, some other list of kind of facilities, then, you also would have power. And if you weren't, then your power would probably be shut off for the duration because there was not any capacity to move those outages around. So this may, again, to kind of the issue of exacerbating existing inequities, might speak to perhaps it wasn't that the utility companies targeted communities of color. It may be that communities of color have fewer of these amenities, things
Right.
like hospitals in their communities. And, I don't know that. But that
Right.
would be a question that I would love to see more research on. Not that it excuses it at all. But I think it would just speak to, well, probably we need maybe some more fire stations and some more hospitals or whatever else in those communities. But, at the end of the day, that's not the answer to the electricity shutoffs. I believe that the answer there is that we need to use our smart meters to more accurately target, the facilities that must stay on all the time so that we can have capacity to, move outages from one area to another. And I think that is, looking at, back to your question about, kind of climate justice, we need to expect that we are going to have more disasters. We are going to have more stress on our systems. So we are not going to entirely avoid these type of hardships, but what we can do is improve how we manage them and make sure that, we are spreading our resources around as best that we can to help as many people as we can. And, looking at, power outages are always a nuisance, but it's when they go on for a prolonged period of time that they become deadly. And I did not need to have power 100% of the time in order to stay alive. And some of the folks who, froze to death during the storm, essentially, died of hypothermia, I shouldn't say froze to death, but, died of hypothermia. I would have been very happy to, have power half of the time, quarter of the time, whatever was equitable so that, my fellow Texans could live. And I think that, probably most people would agree with that. But we don't have any policy that is, demanding that solution be implemented.
What is the state of the smart grid, and is the limit technological? Is it policy driving the technology? Is it how expensive is it? Is the engineering there? Like, what's between us and that?
Yeah, all good questions. I think certainly it's technologically possible. And I say that because, honestly, this is not an area where I have done extensive research, but, when this came up, I immediately started just kind of looking around for where else might utilities be using their smart meters more effectively. And right away, I found a great example. It's actually a utility in South Africa, of all places, that in order to manage, power shortages there, they actually use their smart meters to set a limit. Say, all right, we have this amount of energy for each household. So if you can stay within that limit, then your power stays on. If you go beyond that limit, then your power gets cut off, when there's a shortage, which is very, fair if you think about it, right? So everybody could have enough to keep, their essentials going, but nobody gets to kind of be an energy hog. When there's not enough to go around.
Right.
So looking at that, I think, well, all right, that technology exists.
Right.
And if they can do it in South Africa, surely we could do it here. I don't know what the cost is. And I think the utilities to the policy question are not being pushed to figure out exactly what the cost is, how long it would take to implement. But we do know that most folks have smart meters already installed at their homes. So probably the physical infrastructure is there, and most of what is needed is software improvements. And that doesn't mean that it's not, a significant investment, but look at how much we just, lost.
Billions, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it would be money well spent to make it so that we could manage the next crisis in a much more effective way.
I think next generation environmental justice work needs to include these kinds of very specific proposals, because there's, in the main, we know we've got a big problem, but actually figuring out these infrastructural investments that would change the order of things. And so it's really nice to have this example to work with.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I think we need so much when it comes to this fight. We need folks who are out there really kind of working deep in the community, and people who are providing inspiration, and we also need a little bit of kind of like policy and technical wonkiness, and I think I live somewhere in between all of those. And really I think we need to be able to bring specific solutions, but in a way that can connect with people, because some of these things seem really boring until folks realize that, like, oh, this is the way that, like, I could have not been freezing in my home for 4 days.
Right.
Is there, I know that everywhere, but especially in Texas, you've got vested interests, money-making interests that make it more difficult to move towards just transition. But are there also kind of paradigms in the sincere community, that's, trying to make things better, that you worry about, that you worry that it's excluding possible pathways or reproducing lack of inclusiveness within, what the transition is, or kind of what are in the best articulations of where you're going, what are the things that kind of keep you up at night?
Oh boy. I think that there are a lot of people that are trying to do the right thing. There are a lot of people who are also just, trying to make money, however that might be. And, you find, people that are, just trying to make money in kind of all industries. And for that matter, you find people who want to do the right thing in all industries. But, some of the things that, when it comes to just transition that I, kind of worry about, I guess, especially in Texas, are things like carbon capture and storage, and how that is sometimes put forward as a solution, especially for fossil fuel industries. And, it might possibly deal with part of the problem as it relates to climate change, but it doesn't address so many other associated problems with air quality and water pollution, and just a lot of kind of other things that have a really negative effect on health and well-being in our communities. So I think that's one of those things, and I think that sometimes there are environmental advocates, there are affordability advocates, low-income advocates, and when things are working the best, we all work together, and we're all trying to do what will be good in the short term and the long term for people in general. But sometimes I think it is possible to start kind of splintering the factions and making it seem, I think, incorrectly that clean energy solutions, climate solutions are are unaffordable and and therefore problematic. I think the more data that we get out there, we see that actually what is really unaffordable is the climate crisis. And we see that with Winter Storm Uri. We see that time and again with the floods and the droughts. Yes. And, everything that comes along with the climate crisis that does hit poor people and people of color the worst. And, in a way that it is often, seems like it's just the kind of, natural disaster of the day. But it's one unnatural disaster after another, and we can't afford it. So, my hope is that more and more those of us who are, really sincere about trying to do what's good for, the people of Texas and beyond, we'll keep working together, because I think that is the key to our success.
Do you, both within the COVID pandemic and the power grid crisis, was there cross-agency, cross-issue work at a higher order than you'd seen before, where people in health, people in environment, people in housing? Because from what I've observed as a researcher, there's still pretty stunning silos that separate the work. And I don't know, have you seen any kind of shift in either interest or capacity in that regard?
I think it depends on where you look. I think there are still a lot of, silos in those areas that you just named. But, I think there, is also a recognition that that these issues are interconnected. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, with the Austin Climate Equity Plan, which hasn't been officially adopted, but hopefully will be in September, I think that plan really kind of, puts that truth front and center, that, health and racial equity and climate change, that these are all intertwined, and we need to be taking care of our community as a whole if we're going to be making progress at all. And so I think, that's where you see, like, okay, the Austin Office of Sustainability and others within the city of Austin are recognizing that. And I think you start to see that in some other cities as well. But, I think, like, at the state level in Texas and, still in a lot of places, we haven't quite got there yet.
Do you think that all of the attention to disproportionate burden of COVID and air pollution and all these burdens in communities of color that have come to or been made more visible in the last 2 years, has it made it more possible to center these things in a plan like the climate plan in Austin? Or was it kind of going there anyway and it...
Well, I think in Austin, things are moving that direction anyway. But, I think it kind of bolstered the momentum that we had going there. It's really interesting. I've seen some polling data that, looks at, when people know that, or when you message on the fact that, environmental impacts are maybe disproportionately borne by people of color. It does very different things to different people. If you are already kind of predisposed to care about one or both of those issues, then you probably care even more. And if you're not, then it can actually push people in the other direction. Of saying, like, well, this is a thing that affects somebody else that I maybe do or don't care about. But I think kind of regardless, it is the truth, and we need to keep talking about it, and doing what we can to build momentum wherever we can to deal with these challenges in an intersectional way, because there's just not another viable alternative, I don't think.
Right. I mean, we're talking about the frontline communities. They're going to be impacted, but everyone's going to be impacted, right? I mean, but that doesn't mean that we should, it does mean we should center those who are going to be on the front line, right? But that logic of, like, it's not my problem, that's surprising and unsettling.
It's an interesting challenge to think about the way the kind of foregrounding of the racial equity issues in the environment and energy domain brings with it the antagonisms around those issues that will be part of the next phase of work. A last question I have for you, and James might have another too, is I've been following the Biden administration's promise of pursuing environmental justice across agencies, across policies, and it's impressive what's promised. And I'm keen to see kind of what it begins to look like on the ground. What's been the reception to that in Texas? And is it going to give you space to work, or is it going to almost cloud it with the specter of kind of partisan politics?
I mean, I think that it's kind of always partisan politics in Texas, at least at the state level, when it comes to, a lot of those issues, because, not to say that it's only Republicans that are beholden to the fossil fuel industry. There are Democrats that are as well. But I think that's a challenge either way. So, I remain hopeful that the Biden administration will, uphold the many promises made to kind of roll back all of the damage that has been done by the Trump administration. And, frankly, like we need swifter action than we've seen so far, because people are suffering on the ground and our climate crisis is getting out of control. And, frankly, we just don't have time to wait. So I think that whether the Biden administration goes slow or fast, it doesn't change the politics all that much in Texas. That's what I've seen, is that you might as well go all the way, because those who oppose are going to message as if you are doing something totally crazy just by trying to protect people's, basic health, whether you do something small or you do something big. So you might as well do something big that actually helps people, and you'll get the same kind of negative talking points on Fox News either way.
All right. Well, as Kim said, I have, just so many questions to ask you. So I think this was a really rich conversation. We are coming up on the hour. I think we can end it here and have our own conversations at another time. But thank you again, Kaiba, for coming on. It was a pleasure having you on the show, and we really appreciated this conversation.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you both.
And it's so nice to know you're out there doing the work you're doing.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that, even more than for joining this call. We look forward to watching you going ahead.
Thank you.